Chairman Ferguson, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited.
So when President Trump announced you would become chair, he specifically called out some of the challenges that big tech creates. How is the Ferguson FTC going to address big tech?
Well, again, thanks for having me. I'm excited for this event. I also had not seen the lineup for this event, the full lineup, until I walked in this morning. It's a murderer's row, so you guys should be really proud of the slate you've attracted today.
Thanks so much.
My coming to antitrust law, I'm going to answer your question, but I'm going to give a little history first.
Please.
So my coming to antitrust law, I took it in law school. You learn the doctrine. For anyone who's been to law school, you tend to learn the doctrine, and then you learn like the professor's view of what the right answer is, and then you have to figure out which one you're supposed to give on the exam. I did okay, so I figured it out. And then I was just a sort of like antitrust lawyer in DC law firms. And you don't really, maybe others did, but as a like associate trying to pay off student loans, you don't spend a lot of time thinking about doctrine qua doctrine. You just have a client, the client has a problem, and so within the doctrine you say, how can I fix my client's problems? And so I sort of imbibed the, I'll call it the like corporatist libertarian doctrine of antitrust, or at least that version of it, and said, okay, well, I've got these clients, help them fix their problems. And then I went on the Hill, and that was the sort of first time that I got to think about antitrust sort of outside of the box of antitrust, like looking at it from above and saying, thinking about it as a policy, as a part of our political economy, and as a sort of tool to promote market structures that we want, which requires us to decide what sort of market structures we want. And then my sort of baptism by fire, and I think this was true of a lot of conservatives, was 2020. And I was doing some thinking about antitrust before 2020, but during the sort of George Floyd uprising, I started getting calls from companies, huge companies, their GCs and their trade associations, and they were calling for police reform. I would get calls, and the calls were like, hey, we think cops are really racist, and we really want you guys to do something about this. And my response was, why are you calling me about this? I thought the deal was businesses make widgets. Government will generally leave them alone to make their widgets, and then everyone benefits from this. Why are you weighing in on this sort of like uniquely political question? Also, don't you guys want more police, like keeps your stores and factories safe, et cetera? And then the censorship epidemic, which had been underway for some time, really, really became public and prominent. Americans, couldn't voice on social media platforms if they thought that masks weren't effective, if they had doubts about vaccine safety, if they thought changing election laws in the middle of the 2020 election was unfair or a form of cheating, they couldn't say that either. If they thought that the stuff on Hunter Biden's laptop was meaningful and ought to be discussed, you weren't allowed to report on that either. And that was sort of when I started to understand the criticism about corporate power as a risk, not just about prices and output, which is sort of what you're taught in antitrust doctrine, but that the wielding of market power is a threat to individual liberty, and it's a threat to sort of our political and economic system in more ways than just sort of the classic price and output concerns. And then when I was Solicitor General of Virginia, I was approached actually by one of your speakers, Stohomeki, who was the PDAG in the Justice Department, and said, hey, we are contemplating this suit against Google for its ad tech monopoly. And we would need structural relief, which in layman's parlance is breaking up big tech, breaking up Google's monopoly. We did digging, and I felt very confident about this theory. And then, was thinking we've come sort of a long way where a Republican governor and AG in Virginia are contemplating a suit with the Garland Justice Department to break up Google. But that sort of tracks my own development on this from sort of a ho-hum pedestrian associate who just does what he needs to do for his clients to get paid, starting to think about antitrust, and then recognizing big tech is sort of a serious, and the market power it wields is a pretty serious threat to our market structures, to individual liberty. And the Google suit is very interesting because it's pretty ordinary. All of the theories in the Google ad tech suit are pretty straightforward, just tying illegal acquisitions. No sort of like pie in the sky theory. These were theories that had been lying around for a long time, and people just didn't want to bring the suit. And the reason people weren't bringing the suit had mostly to do with sort of political choices. And I don't mean like Democrat versus Republican political choices, but I mean choices that enforcers make about when it's a good time to pull the trigger. Even if they think there's a viable suit, there was for a long time a preference against intervening in big tech, and it was driven by a couple things. I think it was driven in part by a view that we ought to be very deferential to C-suite decisions because C-suite decisions are being made by free people in a free market. There was a sort of a ideological view that intervention is probably almost always worse than monopoly. And it's sort of a kind of libertarian political view about the relationship of government to the economy. And I think, frankly, this was especially true in the 2010s. There's a great Tablet magazine article about this, but there was a real relationship between sort of the Obama Democrat Party and big tech, and big tech was basically incorporated into the way Democrats hope to govern the country, and so leaving big tech alone was a necessary ingredient to the plan for government.
Yeah. In 2013, he actually explicitly
Exactly.
said, we're not going to bring any enforcement.
Exactly, and they didn't, and that's sort of when the ad tech and search monopolies that Google had started to grow.
Is it fair to say that was a major mistake in 2013?
I mean, I obviously think that was a mistake, and look, this is an interesting conundrum for enforcers that take big tech seriously. We've got two things that we're trying to thread a needle between two sort of opposing problems. The first is we don't, and I think this is especially true for little tech, we don't want an ideological predisposition against M&A activity because M&A is part of how little tech companies can really realize their value. And if people invest in little tech companies and think they can't get their money back out, they just won't invest. People will have their money locked up in little tech companies. So we can't have an ideological predisposition against M&A. It is part of how we innovate because that's what helps unlock capital.
We very much agree.
Yeah, I know, I know you do. But on the other hand, we don't want to have an ideological predisposition that's sort of just government should not intervene, the risk of monopoly is not that bad, and then we wind up in the situation where we have Meta Instagram, where you have a single purchase, and the FTC is going to trial in a couple weeks in the Meta Instagram matter, or the Google ad tech, which involved some acquisitions, although that was mostly about tying. But we both don't want to lock people's investment and dry up capital to our innovators. We also don't want to say well, then we need sort of open season in M&A, everything goes because we want to make sure the capital is flowing. And I think, someone asked me at another conference, or maybe it was an interview, whether what I was proposing was MAGA antitrust. And I guess that it sort of is. My view is I don't want antitrust wedded to either poles, which is categorical, hardcore opposition to M&A activity, which hurts innovation, but I don't want to replace that with monopoly concerns are overstated, government should rarely intervene. I want vigorous antitrust enforcement because it's good for the economy, because I think monopoly can be as dangerous in many ways as big government. I'm sensitive to the argument that big government is bad. I'm a Republican, I've imbibed that for a long time. I don't want to replace big government with big monopoly. I don't like either of them, and I don't think any of us should have to live under either of them. And both of them can obstruct individual liberty in very similar ways. Government is obviously slightly different because they can send men to kick in your door with guns in a way that large companies cannot. But if a company can drive you out of the public square on social media, if they can drive you out of employment, or if they can make sure that your idea that could be groundbreaking, life-changing for tens of millions of Americans, or maybe the whole world, will never see the light of day because it's a potential competitive threat to their monopoly, they can really constrict all of our individual liberty in ways that should terrify us almost to the same extent as government. And so that's what I'm after, is an antitrust policy that recognizes that M&A is part of unlocking innovation, achieving President Trump's golden age, but does not say, therefore we need M&A all the time, that takes antitrust enforcement seriously as one of the ways we prevent replacing big government with big monopoly.
One of the earlier presenters showed this hilarious thing talking about ChatGPT wrappers, but the wrappers are actually wrappers on LLMs, which are then wrappers on NVIDIA chips, which are then wrappers on ASML. I mean, these are technological platforms. And then one of the more egregious things that we've talked a lot about Apple and Google, but they're not the only ones. In the healthcare space, Epic Health is sort of known to do a decent amount of self-preferencing. I mean, how do we ensure that there are open markets and open platforms? And how do you, from the FTC point of view self-preferencing?
Yeah, good question. So I think we all should be really concerned as market participants, wherever we are in the markets, about the idea that a company could build basically a walled platform where they invite you in. Once you're in, it's very hard to leave. And then in order to build things within the walled garden, they either extract a tax or they prevent you from doing it by steering everyone else in the walled garden to their thing. We're going to have sort of an innovative stagnation problem if we have these platforms that were super innovative for a long time, but have ceased to be innovative and instead sort of keep themselves afloat by taxing innovators or making sure that their potentially competitive products never present a real challenge. My view about the best way to do this is antitrust enforcement, and rather than ex-ante regulation. In part because we remain by far the most dynamic, most vibrant, most innovative economy on Earth. And I think part of the reason that has been is that we have prized antitrust enforcement over heavy-handed regulation. Gail Slater, my colleague at the Justice Department, who I think is probably the brightest mind in Republican antitrust right now, said at her confirmation hearing, vigorous antitrust enforcement is the way we avoid ex-ante regulation. And so I watched the Epic, Google, and Apple cases with great interest, and I think that these are like viable theories. Part of the problem that the courts are rapping with is that there's been a view among some in the judiciary that because Apple's operating system and Google's operating system are competitive early on in the sort of like transaction chain, they remain competitive even once you're bought into the system. I have my own doubts about that as like a factual matter. I mean, the first smartphone I ever purchased was an Apple in like 2012, and I've never gotten out of the ecosystem. And so I think I think for a lot of Americans, if they hear once you've bought into it that Samsung and Google, or Apple and Google continue to compete, they would probably raise an eyebrow a bit. And so I think these theories have a lot of force. But I think that's the way to do it is confront these with our antitrust laws. Now, if it turns out the antitrust laws as currently written are insufficient to protect innovation, because that's the thing that we're actually after here is, the cautionary tale here is Europe, which is an economy full of like great people, but they're not growing, they're not innovating at a high speed, certainly not at our rate. And we're trying to keep that sort of pioneering, innovative American spirit alive. And if the antitrust laws are not doing enough to promote innovation on these platforms, I do think it's appropriate for Congress to consider alternatives. But I think we have to start by exhausting all of the available antitrust tools like Epic did in Epic Google. And obviously we'll see how it turns out on appeal, but I think that theory shows great promise.
Speaking of Europe, Europe's Digital Markets Act has been hailed by startup founders as an exciting tool to curb the most egregious forms of self-dealing by companies like Apple and Google. Founders are already having conversations with the DMA team about how their smart wearable technology might be able to interact with Apple devices with new interoperability rules that the DMA hopes to unlock. Would the U.S. benefit from a law similar to DMA that specifically prohibited some of the abuses we're seeing from Apple and Google. So startup founders don't have to wait for the government to bring successful prosecution against these firms.
So the answer is, I don't know, maybe. Congress has got, IACOA has been in play, open app markets has been in play. I don't want to sort of take a position on that while Congress is trying to work this out. As an enforcer of the current antitrust laws, my view are, let's see what can be done with the current ones. If Congress thinks it's not enough, great. If they want to provide additional theories, I think that's great. And I do think that the goal always needs to be promote and protect innovation. And I think that that's been one of the hallmarks of the Trump administration. And I think the deregulatory spirit and ensuring that no monopoly can suppress innovation are coming from the exact same place. That the desire to unlock innovation by deregulating, making sure government is no larger than necessary to carry out the vital services, is the exact same impulse as the one that says we shouldn't let monopolies suppress innovation in order to protect their monopoly rents. On the DMA itself, my own view as an American is I'm very suspicious of laws that appear to have been written to get at American companies abroad. One of the features of the DMA that concerns me the most is that, there are a couple. So again, I share your concerns and the concerns of your founders with platforms using their walled garden to suppress innovation. It's a real problem. I think it is probably one of the biggest threats to innovation confronting the American economic landscape today. But I am really wary about Brussels bureaucrats being given the power basically to level fines. In America, if I think someone has committed an antitrust violation, I have to prove it in court. In the DMA, it's the reverse. The bureaucrats say, pay the fine. You can sue us to try to stop us. The fine will continue accruing in the interim. So it can make challenging it very costly. So I'm concerned about the due process issues. I also, if the goal of the DMA is to sort of unlock innovation in Europe, we don't have a DMA equivalent here, and we're innovating. And so I've got my doubts about whether this is, really about that. And the fact that the fines under the DMA are not tied to the business being conducted by the firm in Europe. It's worldwide revenue. It starts to look like the DMA is sort of like a form of taxing American companies. And my own view is, if we think that Americans are suffering from anti-competitive conduct at home, we should address it here at home. I don't want the Europeans doing it for us, number one. And number two, I definitely don't want the Europeans basically levying taxes on American firms, no matter what the conduct is. I think it ought to be up to us sort of discipline the conduct of the firm. So I have real concerns about the way that the DMA is structured, the fact that only one European company even qualifies for gatekeeper status under the DMA. But as I said earlier, I think that Epic's suit against Google has real promise, and the concerns Epic has raised in the Google suit, I think, are real antitrust concerns that have to be addressed.
The FTC was in the news a couple of weeks ago because President Trump fired Democratic commissioners Alvaro Bedoya and Becca Slaughter. This is a break with almost 100 years of precedent where the FTC is supposed to operate independently from the White House. I'm not concerned about whether that's true or not, or arguing whether it's good or bad. I am curious, do you think the absence of minority party commissioners at the commission will change how founders interface with the FTC?
I don't think so. My view about the FTC's mission is entirely unchanged. For what it's worth, I know that you're not arguing with it, but I think it's important to say. My view is that the president unequivocally had the authority to remove them after CELA law in 2020. I think it's plain as day. I know that there's litigation on this, and the courts will resolve this, but I'm firmly of the view that he had the authority, and that independent agencies is not good for a democracy. All powerful executive branch officials should be accountable to the people on whose behalf we are governing. And the only person in the executive branch that gets elected is the president, which means accountability runs through the president. So I think that ensuring that there isn't freestanding elements of the federal government independent from all accountability is super important for a democracy. That said, I don't think it will change the way founders interact with the FTC. My job the day before the removals is the same as it is today, which is vigorously enforce the antitrust laws, and protect American consumers from high prices, low output, deprived innovation, low quality choice, or low product quality in the absence of product choice. And that is no less true now than it was before. So, the FTC is going on. The day itself was, it was a day, but the FTC is already sort of back on its mission, and the mission is unchanged. And so I don't think anyone here should think that this will change, anything about how they interact with the FTC. My desire to vigorously enforce the antitrust laws is no different now than it was then. We'll have a third commissioner here pretty soon. I see him in the audience. And I don't think it will change when he gets there either. It's full steam ahead on enforcing the antitrust laws and protecting American consumers from monopoly and from fraud.
So I'm so excited that you're here today and to hear your words. I am absolutely astonished at how cool it is to bring together such a different set of builders, legislators, regulators. I think it's too rare, and so I have to take the opportunity and ask. I mean, Chairman Ferguson, are there things that you would want to say to an audience full of builders? So there are a number of people who are presenting here today, and they're in the audience in this physical room, but there are more than 10,000 people watching online, many of whom are builders scattered throughout our beautiful country of the United States of America. What do you have to say to them?
Two things. The first is that you all are a huge part of what makes America great. It's ABA spring meeting. I am not attending any of the events. FTC political appointees are also not attending any of the events. But it has brought together a lot of foreign enforcers, and so I've had bilateral meetings with foreign enforcers. And one of the things that I've been saying is, trying to understand why America innovates and grows the way it does, but Europe does not. And there are all sorts. I think it's probably overdetermined. There are all sorts of reasons, but the one that I keep settling on is that America was built on this pioneering spirit and a willingness to take real risks, and that failure is not fatal. And if you fail, you pick yourself back up and you try something else. And the builders are like the 21st century embodiment of the pioneers. They want to try something that hasn't been tried before. They're willing to take a gamble on it. They're willing to stake, sort of a personal claim on it. That is part of what makes America so great. And that spirit is so rare anywhere else in the world. And I think it's super important that government do everything it can to keep that spirit kindled. And that means making sure that government is not too big and making sure that monopolies do not pour water on that spirit. So you guys are part of what is making America the great place that it is, number one. Number two, from our offices in Washington, we see a lot of what's going on in the economy and in our markets, but not everything. And there are all sorts of things that happen that I just can't sort of see from the chairman's desk. I think it's really important that builders feel like they can come to the FTC if they think that there are monopoly problems, anti-competitive conduct that's otherwise injuring consumers. You shouldn't assume that we're just sort of magically aware of it. The fact that it's happening to you doesn't mean we know it's happening. And you should feel free to come to the FTC and say, hey, look, we're trying to do this thing, we're trying to build this thing, we're trying to bring this idea to the fore, and there are problems, and we feel like they're competitive problems, and we don't know if anyone's doing anything about it. And look, it might be that for resource reasons or the state of the law or whatever, there won't be something that can be done immediately about it, but we don't know everything happening in our markets all the time. And the way we find out is people tell us. We have this massive system for filing consumer complaints, and it drives a huge proportion of our work, and it's awesome, and it's one of the best tools the FTC has. But another one is the sort of informal ability of people to come to the FTC and say, hey, there's this problem, are you aware? And often I'll go, no, I had no idea. So builders should feel free to come to us and say, hey, we think there's a problem out there, a systemic problem or a problem that's aimed sort of like people like us. can you help? We might not be able to, but it's at least good to know it's out there.
Chairman Ferguson, everyone, thank you so much. Thanks for joining us.